In this lecture, I'm going to talk about chapter 13 of Rabindranath Tagore's My Reminiscences, and this chapter is called My Father. So, if you have read chapters 1 through chapter 15, you probably have noticed that until chapter 13, Tagore, even though he does mention his father sometimes, his father is not a character in any of the incidents that he mentions before, right? So, in chapter 13, for the first time, we see Rabindranath Tagore's father becoming a character in some of the incidents that he mentions. In fact, from chapter 13 onwards, chapter 13, 14, and 15, I have these three chapters in mind. In these chapters, almost all of the incidents, well, maybe barring a few, most of the incidents are stories where Tagore's father is a character, right? We have seen isolated incidents where Tagore's father was mentioned in the previous chapters. For example, we know that Tagore used to go to the terrace and he used to sneak into his father's room, and then he used to lay down on the sofa, take bath, etc., etc. So we have instances in the earlier chapters as well where Tagore mentions his father, but then proper communication with his father or incidents involving his father have not really been prominent until now, except those isolated incidents like the one I mentioned to you just now, or other isolated incidents like the instance where Tagore's music teacher goes to his father's and informs him um, about Rabindranath Tagore's singing and songwriting abilities. Right. So those are just isolated instances. But let's have a look at chapter 13, where for the first time we will get to see Tagore's father as a character. So the first excerpt goes as follows. Shortly after my birth, my father took to constantly traveling about. So it is no exaggeration to say that in my early childhood, I hardly knew him. He would now and then come back home all of a sudden, and with him came foreign servants with whom I felt extremely eager to make friends. Once there came, in this way, a young Punjabi servant named Linu. The cordiality of the reception he got from us would have been worthy of Ranjit Singh himself. Not only was he a foreigner, but a Punjabi to boot. What wonder he stole our hearts away. So, a few things to notice here, a few things to be cautious here about. So, first of all, note that um, this Punjabi servant Lenu is referred to as a foreigner. Now you have to keep in mind that at the time this text was written, and also the time period when these incidents were taking place, India was British India first of all, and second of all, India did not have the political entity or did not have the political unity it has today. In other words, the map that you associate with India today as a political entity did not exist at that time. So it was more like Punjab was one province of the British Empire, Bengal was another province of the British Empire, then again Madras was another province, Bombay was another province, right? Bombay Presidency, Bengal Presidency, Madras Presidency. You must have heard these names. So, what I'm trying to communicate to you is that even though these were all provinces under the British Raj, under British India, so to speak, India was not a unified country yet, right? That happens in 1947. So when Tagore speaks of Ranjit Singh or Lenu here, the Punjabi servant, as a foreigner, you should know precisely what he's talking about. It's in a precisely historical context. So do not wonder why is Tagore referring to a Punjabi man as a foreigner, right? So I hope I have made that clear to you. Now to come back to the incident, Tagore says, and you already have an idea of Tagore's character from your reading of this text, and also from your reading and your knowledge of Rabindranath Tagore's ideas on nationalism. Rabindranath Tagore is a true cosmopolitan character. He is an individual who believes in internationalism. He believes that the entire world should be a country, if you remember from our lessons on nationalism. Now, this is important because he, as you can see, as has already been evident in multiple instances in your readings of My Reminiscences and otherwise, that Tagore does not differentiate between people. At least he does not believe in differentiation between people. He does not see different races, different communities, different cultures as something he should stay away from. He does not have that xenophobia, if you remember the term. He does not have a cultural chauvinism that his culture is the best and everyone else's culture is inferior. He does not have that. Naturally, it appears to be instinctive in his case that he should want to make friends with every foreign servant that he comes across. Now, his father was a well-known man. His father, worked with the British government at that time, and his father was also one of the key figures of the Bengal Renaissance. Right, his father was a key figure at that time in Bengali and Indian culture, by and large. Right, so you see, he traveled a lot, as Tagore has already mentioned, and many times when he came back from his travels, he used to bring these servants along from all of these places he visited. And Punjab is just one instance where his father visited and brought back this servant named Linu, with whom Tagore was extremely eager to make friends with. And he says that the same was the case with every other servant who came from every other part of the country. When I say, I speak of post 1947. Before 1947, remember, India was under British rule, so it was not the country you know about today, right? Keep that in mind. Let's read forward. Caged in the house as we were, anything savoring of foreign parts had a peculiar charm for me. This was one of the reasons why I made so much of Lenu. This was also the reason why Gabriel, the Jew, with his embroidered gabardine, who came to sell atars and scented oils, stirred me so, and the huge Kabulis, with their dusty, baggy trousers and knapsacks and bundles, wrought on my young mind a fearful fascination. You see, Tagore, after talking about Lino, he says that my fascination for foreign lands, remember that he was caged for much of his life. And when I say caged, do not imagine Tagore being placed in a kind of jail. That was not the case. If you remember our lectures, previous lectures on my reminiscences, and if you have read the text, surely you know that Tagore is referring to his situation at home where he was not really allowed to go outside, and that has recurred as a motive in this text several times. Naturally, his fascination towards anything foreign was a great deal, right? And so when Gabriel the Jew um, came as a salesman to sell his scented oils and everything else he sold, or when the Kabuliwalas, Tagore also has a very very famous short story known as the Kabuliwala, right? And if you haven't read it, you must not miss it. It's an absolute wonder of a story. It's a absolute beauty of a story. Nevertheless, the point I was trying to make is Tagore clearly had this fascination for these foreigners, and this fascination, he calls it a fearful fascination. Now, when he calls it a fearful fascination, do not wonder that Tagore was afraid of these people, right? He is using what is known as an oxymoron, right? So, what is an oxymoron? Oxymoron is a literary device, and I'm not going to give you away. Uh, I'll give you a hint though. I'll give you an example, a hint in the form of an example, and I will leave it to your instinct of discovery, so that you can go and look it up what oxymoron means. So I'll give you an example of oxymoron. Uh, so there is this story by Saki where a certain character is asked to describe how his trip was, or how actually it was a story how the story was, and this character, a young boy, replies, "It was horribly good." Right, now, horribly good does not mean that the story was horrible, right? So that is also an oxymoron. So I just give you a clue, and I want you to use this clue to find out what an oxymoron means, and using that definition or whatever example you come across while doing your research on oxymoron, use that to understand what Tagore means when he says fearful fascination. But surely Tagore was not afraid of these people representing foreign cultures, right? So let's now move forward and look at the next excerpt. He says, "Once, while my father was away in the Himalayas, that old bogey of the British government, the Russian invasion came to be a subject of agitated conversation among the people. My mother was seriously alarmed. Possibly the other members of the family did not share her misgivings, so, despairing of grown up sympathy, she sought my boyish support. Won't you write to your father about the Russians? She asked. So, as you can see, Tagore has already mentioned his father was away, and during this one incident where the news of the Russian invasion or rumors of the Russian invasion became prominent, um, his mother became fearful of what might happen to his father if the Russians did actually invade, right? And this was an instance where Tagore wrote his first letter to his father. So, this is the first time we are hearing of Tagore communicating with his father, right? Let's see what happens. That letter, Tagore says, carrying the tidings of my mother's anxieties, was my first one to my father. I got a reply to my letter. My father asked me not to be afraid. If the Russians came, he would drive them away himself. That is what he had written in the letter. This confident assurance did not seem to have the effect of relieving my mother's fears, but it served to free me from all timidity as regards my father. All right. So one important thing to break down here is that, remember, Tagore did not really have much communication with his father before that, right? He mentioned earlier that soon after he was born, his father used to run errands for the British government at times, and that used to keep him away from home a lot, right? And he used to come back home once in a while. Naturally, Tagore did not have much company with his father, and he had, since there was a distance that was already created between father and son, he was a bit timid about communicating with his father. And it was this rumor of Russian invasion which led his mother to be anxious, and his mother's anxiety led to her telling young Rabindranath Tagore to write a letter to his father. And as you now know, this was the first letter, and probably the first major act of communication Tagore has done with his father, right? And he gets a reply, and he gets a playful reply from his father. His father says, yes, if the Russians attack, don't worry, I will drive them away myself, right? So it's a playful reply. And even though this reply does not do much to relieve his mother's anxieties and fears, it surely takes all that timidity away from Tagore with regards to him approaching his father, right? So now he's not fearful anymore about approaching his father. Now he knows that, well, if I write a letter to my father, he'll probably reply. In other words, he essentially knows that the distance between him and his father, I'm not talking physical distance, I'm talking emotional distance here, right? That distance between his father and him has shortened, and his father has become more approachable in his mind, right? But let's see where this approachability goes. On one occasion, my father came home to invest the three of us, three young children in the house, including Rabindranath Tagore, with the sacred thread that Brahmins take, right? Um, that is what is referred to as here. With shaven heads and gold rings in our ears, we three budding Brahmins went into a 3 days retreat in a portion of the third story. So they were instructed to, kind of go on seclusion for 3 days before a certain ceremony takes place. And that ceremony, once that ceremony is officiated, they become Brahmins. So basically, they had to wait for 3 days before they could officiate that ceremony, right? And it's very, very much, for those of you who do not have an idea, this is a kind of tradition that exists in some Brahmin households, and according to that tradition, before getting the sacred thread, the person, the child in this case, who is going to be officiated as a Brahmin, is supposed to live in seclusion for a certain amount of time, right? And then the ceremony takes place. All right, so let's see what happens. Tagore says it was great fun. The earrings gave us a good handle to pull each other's ears with. We found a little drum lying in one of the rooms. Taking this, we would stand out in the veranda, and when we caught sight of any servant passing alone in the story below, we would rap a tattoo on it. In short, we cannot claim that these days of our retirement were passed in ascetic meditation. So Tagore is essentially telling us that this ceremony that is supposed to take 3 days later, it may require us to live in seclusion for 3 days, but we made the best out of it. We had great fun, right? We were supposed to, uh, indulge in ascetic meditation, but instead of doing that, we pulled each other's ears, and whenever we saw a servant going passing by, we used to use that drum which we found in one of the rooms, and we used to try and disturb the servant, right? So he's essentially saying he had great fun before this ceremony. Then he says, I am, however, persuaded that boys like ourselves could not have been rare in the hermitages of old. And if some ancient document has it that the 10 or 12-year-old is spending the whole of the days of his boyhood offering oblations and chanting mantras, we are not compelled to put unquestioning faith in the statement, because the book of boy nature is even older and also more authentic. So Tagore is saying that when he was sent with his two companions to these 3 days of seclusion, he had great fun. And he believes that even in ancient times, when such ceremonies were held, it's not like the boys always, went in seclusion and had meditation for 3 days constantly, right? He's convinced that probably they had fun too. So he's questioning that if it is written in any scripture or any ancient document that the boys who were to be officiated as Brahmins were spending 3 days in complete meditation, that is probably not something you should put unquestioning faith on, right? Because he says the nature of a child, in this case, the nature of boys, is even older and more authentic. So, in other words, children, no matter how much you force them to sit for ascetic meditation and send them to seclusion, they will do childish things. They will try and find out a way to have fun out of the situation, right? Now, going forward, uh, Tagore, once again, like I said, this is a chapter which has some insight. The succeeding two chapters you'll find are incident based, and it will be possible to talk about both the chapters in one go. But this is a chapter which does contain some philosophizing, some commentary from Tagore. In other words, it's a chapter of insight, not just a chapter of incident. Let's see what insight Tagore has to offer in this chapter. He says, the main object of teaching is not to explain meanings, but to knock at the door of the mind. If any boy is asked to give an account of what is awakened in him at such knocking, he will probably say something very silly. For what happens within is much bigger than what he can express in words. Those who pin their faith on university examinations as a test of all educational results take no account to this fact of this fact. So once again, Tagore, the educationist, comes to the fore as a commentator, right? And Tagore says that the purpose of teaching is not to explain meanings, right, but to evoke questions, right? So even when a person has not properly understood a meaning of something, that doesn't mean that this person hasn't learned anything, right? He still has learned, he still has acquired knowledge, right? And that knowledge that he or she has acquired may not be easily expressed in words. And this is something university education demands, right? University examinations, college examinations in your case, um, they demand that in, say, a certain number of words which is decided by the university, within that limitation you have to express your thoughts on a certain question. And this is problematic, as Tagore says, right? Because you may have understood any of the lessons or any of the texts that you read in your own way, and that may be difficult to express in the way in which the university demands you to express it, right? So Tagore essentially is being critical of the university education system and says that if you see the university education system, the university examination system, as a proper test, as an authentic test, that is probably not a correct measure of one's educational standards. Then he says, then he gives some examples from his own life, some incidents. He speaks from his own life where he tries to show why his thesis about the education system, his idea that university education is not a justified measure of one's learning. So he tries to give these examples to show you that, to make that point of his. Now, what are these examples? We'll read next. I can recollect, he says, many things which I did not understand, but which stirred me deeply. So, even though he did not understand it clearly, it moved him as a person, right? Once, on the roof terrace of our riverside villa, my eldest brother, at the sudden gathering of clouds, repeated aloud some stanzas from Kalidas's Cloud Messenger. Right? This is the original name for this is Meghdut. Right? In English, it goes as Cloud Messenger. I could not, nor had I the need to, understand a word of the Sanskrit. His ecstatic declamation of the sonorous rhythm was enough for me. So you see, Tagore, in this case, his brother was deeply moved by the gathering of clouds, as it often happens, I'm sure, um, and he was reading aloud instinctively. He was reciting some lines from this poem, this very famous poem by Kalidas known as Meghdut or Cloud Messenger here. And Tagore says, I did not understand the words. I did not know enough Sanskrit to understand what my brother was reciting. But the sound of the recitation itself was enough for me, right? So even if he did not understand something, it did stir him deeply. And this again goes to prove his point that university education does not take into account a situation like this. Now, university education would have given a quote and told the student to explain the meaning of the quote, right? Something like that. Uh, and Tagore says why this is incorrect, why such an assessment is incomplete, right? If not altogether outrageous, right? Now, a few more examples to the similar end, to a similar end. Then again, before I could properly understand English, a profusely illustrated edition of the Old Curiosity Shop fell into my hands. I went through the whole of it, though at least 9/10 of the words were unknown to me. Yet, with the vague ideas I conjured up from the rest, I spun out a variously colored thread on which to string the illustrations. Any university examiner would have given me a great big zero, but the reading of the book had not proved for me quite as empty as all that. Right? Once again, he's making think of this. Think about reading a comic book. Right? Think about a young child being handed a comic book. Now, this young child, I'm sure this is an experience which some of you may have had because in your childhood if you were given a book at a time when you did not yet know to read, right? I mean, if you were given a comic book at that time, you would probably, make a narrative of your own based on the images, based on the sequence of images or the chronology of images. You will not be able to read the words probably uh, because you don't know reading at that stage, but you will probably, conjure a story in your mind based on the sequence of the images, right? And that is exactly what Tagore has done here. He says, I got a copy of the Old Curiosity Shop and it was illustrated, and 9 out of 10 words were unknown to me. He knew maybe a few basic words. He knew, say, I don't know, very common English words, but those common English words were not enough to read a work of literature. But he says this book was illustrated, and just by turning the pages, just from the sequence of the images, I was able to conjure up a meaning. I was able to conjure up a story, right? And he says that if in an university examination he were to be asked a question from this text, he would get a big zero, right? But he knows that his reading was not fruitless. His reading was pleasurable to him because he was able to conjure a story, and that pleasure in itself is a great deal, and that pleasure cannot be quantified by the university education system, right? Remember, he's essentially saying that this education system wants to quantify everything, right? Quantify, for example, if you write an answer, your teacher has to give marks on, say, 15 or 20. So it has to be quantified. And Tagore is not really happy with this quantified assessment, right? And he knows that it is difficult to come out of that system. And he, of all the people in the world, he took steps um, to allow for such a change. Now, to what extent it was successful, to what extent that success has been retained today as you sit for examinations, that is a different topic altogether. All right, let's move forward and see what he says next. He says, another time I had accompanied my father on a trip on the Ganges in his houseboat. Among the books he had with him was an old Fort William edition of Jayadev's Geet Govinda, right? It's written Gita Govinda, but the text, the Bengali name for the text is Geet Govinda, right? And here it's written as Gita Govinda, right? It was in the Bengali character. In other words, it was written in the Bengali script. The verses were not printed in separate lines, but ran on like prose. I did not then know anything of Sanskrit, yet, because of my knowledge of Bengali, many of the words were familiar. I cannot tell how often I read the Git Govinda. I had to discover for myself the intricate meter of Jayadev. Jayadev is the poet, right? And Jayadev is a very old poet. He had written, say, during the Bhakti movement. This was, say, I think 700 or 800 years ago. And I may not be saying this accurately, so please check on me, right? Check on this information and find out whether Jayadev was a contemporary to people like Kabir and Mirabai, maybe, right? So I may not be accurate about this information because this is very ancient, old literature, and I'm not too well familiar with it myself. But my hunch is it's probably from that period. But nonetheless, the point that Tagore is trying to make here is that he was so moved by this text, despite not knowing all the words, he was able to make some sense of many of the words because of his familiarity, because he knew Bengali well. So he was able to, kind of guess or estimate the meaning of many of the Sanskrit words. And he says that it took me a while to understand or to familiarize myself with the intricate meter of Jayadev. And when we say meter, we are talking about the poetic meter, right? You have all heard of iambic pentameter, iambic hexameter, and you may have learned about some of it in your prosody classes. So that is the kind of meter Tagore is talking about here. So he says Jayadev's meter was intricate, and it took me a while to familiarize myself with it because its divisions were lost in the clumsy prose form of the book, and this discovery gave me very great delight. So once again, you see, it's a similar instance where understanding is relegated to less necessary place, right? Our education system places too much emphasis on education, on understanding, right? And the ability to translate that understanding into words and write in university or college examinations. But Tagore is not really in favor of this system, and he suggests that understanding is a very bad benchmark for judging how much a student has learned, right? And there should be more emphasis on many of the other areas that he has pointed out in these incidents from his own life. So let's let's listen to his commentary now. He says, whoever goes back to his early childhood will agree that his greatest gains were not in proportion to the completeness of his understanding. This is exactly what I just told you, right? Too much emphasis on understanding and too much emphasis on translating what you have understood into words to be expressed in your answer sheets. Our Kathaks, right? Kathaks are people who are storytellers who used to move around like bards, right? Shakespeare the bard. Similarly, Kathaks in ancient India, definitely in the olden days in Bengal, there were Kathaks who used to move around from one village to another, one town to another, and in a gathering of people, they used to tell stories. That was their skill. That was their art. That was their craft. Our Kathaks know this truth well, so their narratives always have a good proportion of ear-filling Sanskrit words and abstruse remarks not calculated to be fully understood by their simple hearers, but only to be suggestive. Right? So Tagore, again, remember what was his thesis? His thesis was that the education system places too much emphasis on understanding and too much emphasis on translating that understanding and writing in the answer script. And Tagore shows that the Kathaks, these storytellers, they had this unique skill that they would use such words in their storytelling that uh, that the intention of their story was not to be fully understood but to be suggestive. So in other words, when, say, if a class full of students, if a class of, say, your class of 45 or 50 students, if you heard one of these kathaks, all 50 of you would have at least a slightly different interpretation of what was told. That's what Tagore is saying. Because remember, university education, whenever it asks a question, many of the times, even though I must say this happens less in English, because it's literature, you're studying in English literature, Bengali literature, in literature subjects this happens less, because you still have some degree of freedom, right? Because you are allowed to interpret. Many of the times the questions that are asked to you are your opinions. What do you think? Do you think that this is this? Do you think this can be called an autobiography? Do you think this is an elegy poem? I hope you are able to see what I'm trying to tell you. I'm trying to tell you that in literature, there is perhaps a degree of freedom, but then again, the university does put restrictions on you. The university will ask you to produce an answer within 800 words, or say, will want a very specific kind of answer, for which you will be awarded a certain kind of marks. So Tagore is not very happy with this arrangement, right? He finds this very deplorable. Let's see what happens next, what he says next. The value of each suggestion, of such suggestion, is by no means to be despised by those who measure education in terms of material gains and losses. These insist on trying to sum up the account and find out exactly how much of the lesson imparted can be rendered up. This is exactly what I was telling you, that the education system insists that you, first of all, you understand, all of you understand the same thing, and then all of you produce that same understanding, translate that same understanding in your words, and then render it, or put it, jot it down in your answer scripts. But children, Tagore says, and those who are not overeducated dwell in their primal paradise, where men can come to know without fully comprehending each step. So Tagore believes, again to repeat, that there is too much emphasis on comprehension or understanding. There should be a greater degree of suggestivity or suggestion, so that everyone has a different interpretation. And only when that paradise is lost comes the evil day, when everything needs must be understood. The road which leads to knowledge without going through the dreary process of understanding, that is the royal road, right? So again, Tagore is being very romantic in his theorizing. In his theory of the education system, he believes there is too much emphasis on understanding, and the education system should be redesigned in such a way that knowledge and understanding should not be seen as complementary, right? So it should not be necessary for understanding to be a criteria for knowledge, as it were, right? So this chapter, as I was saying at the beginning of this lecture, is not just incident based. There are a few incidents from Tagore's life, but this is a chapter which emphasizes on insight. The next two chapters, however, will be more insight based, will be more incident based, and those are the two chapters we are going to talk about in the subsequent lectures.